All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving deep into the kind of crazy world where blockchain and AI collide.
Yeah.
And everybody's talking about both of these things independently. But what happens when you put them together?
Right.
That's what we're going to get into today.
I think it's really cool to see what emerges when you combine these two really powerful technologies.
Yeah.
Right?
We should probably set the stage
Absolutely.
a little bit, for folks who maybe haven't.
Yeah.
Spend as much time thinking about it. What is blockchain at its core?
Well, so blockchain is this really interesting technology because at its heart, it's a pretty simple idea.
Okay.
It's essentially a way to record information in a way that's really, really hard to tamper with.
Yeah.
Right? So imagine a digital ledger that's spread out across a bunch of different computers.
Okay.
And every time a new piece of information is added, it's this whole network has to agree on it. And so that makes it really difficult for anyone to go back and change something.
Yeah.
Because they'd have to change it on all of those computers at the same time.
Right.
And that's pretty much impossible.
Yeah, that's one of the things that really drew me in. Early on in my thinking about blockchain was the sort of this almost like a philosophical or moral or ethical. It felt more trustworthy in some way because of that.
Right. And it creates this transparency too.
Yeah.
Because everyone can see the ledger. You can go back and look at the entire history of transactions or information, whatever's been recorded on that blockchain.
Yeah.
And so it just eliminates this whole problem of trusting a single authority.
Right. Like a bank or
exactly a government or something like that.
Government, right?
Yeah.
It's the network itself.
Exactly.
And then, so how do you explain, in layman's terms, what AI is?
So AI, it gets thrown around a lot these days. Right. But at its core, it's basically about creating computer systems that can do things that normally require human intelligence.
Okay.
So things like understanding language, recognizing patterns, making decisions, learning from experience.
Right.
These are all things that we traditionally thought of as uniquely human abilities.
Yeah.
And AI is trying to replicate those abilities in machines.
Okay.
And the way it often does this is by training these algorithms on huge amounts of data.
Right.
So you might feed an AI system millions of images of cats and dogs, and eventually it will learn to distinguish between a cat and a dog.
Got it.
Right.
Yeah.
And the more data you feed it, the better it gets at performing these tasks.
Okay.
And it's pretty amazing what AI can do these days.
Right.
You've got self-driving cars. You've got these systems that can write pretty convincing text.
Yeah.
It's a really rapidly evolving field.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things in my day-to-day life that has been changed by AI is spam filters.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's you never really think about it, but it's wow, that's all AI
True, yeah.
doing its thing.
Totally. Yeah.
So, okay, now we've got these two things, we kind of understand what they are in isolation, but where do they intersect?
So that's the really fascinating part, right?
Yeah.
Is when you start to think about how these two technologies can actually complement each other.
Yeah.
Because they both have their own strengths and weaknesses, right?
Right.
So blockchain, as we talked about, it's great for security and transparency and trust.
Right.
But it can have some limitations with scalability, right? How much data it can handle and how quickly it can process transactions. Yeah. And then AI, on the other hand, it's great for analyzing data and making predictions, but it's really reliant on the quality of that data.
That's right.
Right? Like you were saying, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
So the cool thing is that when you combine them, they can actually address each other's limitations.
Right.
So you can use blockchain to provide that secure and tamper-proof data source for AI.
Okay.
Which makes the AI's insights more reliable.
Gotcha.
And you can use AI to help optimize blockchain's efficiency and scalability.
Okay.
So it becomes this really powerful synergy.
So let's dive into that a little bit. What are some of the specific ways that they can help each other?
So one of the biggest areas, I think, is in data integrity and trust.
Okay.
Right? Like we were saying, AI needs good data to work properly.
Right.
But in the real world, data can be messy. It can be incomplete.
Right.
It can be prone to manipulation.
Right.
And so blockchain can really help with that.
Okay.
Because it provides this kind of anchor of truth for the data
Okay.
Right? So you can store data on a blockchain and know that it hasn't been tampered with, that it's authentic, and it has this whole history that you can track.
Gotcha.
And so for AI, this is huge.
Yeah.
Because it means that the AI can be more confident in the decisions that it's making.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right.
Yeah, so how about security? Because I know that's another one of the big...
Security is another huge one.
Right.
Because blockchain itself, it's designed to be secure.
Right.
It's decentralized, so there's no single point of failure.
Right.
But you can actually enhance that security even further by adding AI.
Okay.
So you can use AI to monitor the blockchain network for any suspicious activity.
Okay.
Right? So like AI can detect patterns that might indicate a hack or fraud.
Got it.
And it can alert the system so that action can be taken.
Okay.
And AI is really good at this kind of pattern recognition.
Right.
You know, it can analyze huge amounts of data and find these subtle anomalies that humans might miss.
Yeah. And humans, especially in security, like get bored.
Exactly.
Yeah. They're doing the same thing over and over again.
Totally.
Whereas AI can do that.
Yeah.
It
doesn't get tired.
All day.
Exactly. Yeah. And it can do it much faster.
Right.
So it just creates this much more robust security layer.
Got it.
For the blockchain.
Okay. So we've got beta, we've got security. Now we get into this whole conversation about scalability and efficiency.
Right. Yeah. And this is where I think AI can really shine.
Okay.
Because blockchain, especially some of the earlier implementations of blockchain, have had some issues with scalability.
Right.
Right. Like how many transactions they can process per second.
Right.
How much energy they consume.
Yeah.
And AI can actually be used to address those issues.
Okay.
So, for example, AI can be used to optimize the way that transactions are processed on the blockchain.
Okay.
It can also be used to develop more efficient consensus mechanisms, which is the way that the blockchain network agrees on which transactions are valid. And so by using AI to make these processes more efficient, you can actually make the blockchain more scalable and more sustainable.
So it can basically take the sort of heavy lifting that the blockchain's having to do.
Exactly.
And make that easier and more efficient.
Yeah, and that's especially important as we see more and more applications of blockchain.
Right.
Because if we want to use blockchain for things like supply chain management or voting or healthcare, we need it to be able to handle a lot of transactions really quickly.
Okay.
And AI can help us get there.
Okay, cool. What about smart contracts? Because that's another...
Yeah, smart contracts. So these are basically self-executing contracts, right? So you write the terms of the contract into code.
Right.
And then they automatically execute on the blockchain when certain conditions are met.
Right.
But the problem with traditional smart contracts is that they're kind of static.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
They can only do what they're programmed to do. And so AI can actually make them a lot smarter.
How so?
So, for example, you can integrate AI into a smart contract to allow it to analyze data and make decisions based on that data.
Okay.
So let's say you have a smart contract for insurance. You could integrate AI to analyze the policyholder's risk profile and then adjust the premiums accordingly.
Got it.
Or you could have a smart contract for supply chain management that uses AI to track the location of goods and automatically trigger payments when they reach certain checkpoints.
So you can basically have AI sort of running in the background of that contract, making those micro decisions based on what it sees.
Exactly. It can make them much more dynamic and responsive to real world conditions.
Okay. Now, what about decentralized AI ecosystems? Because I know that's
that's
really interesting.
Kind of a newer concept.
Yeah, it's a relatively new concept.
And it's basically about using blockchain to create these marketplaces for AI services.
Okay.
So right now, a lot of the AI development is happening in these big centralized companies, right? Like Google, Facebook, Amazon.
Yeah.
They have access to all the data. They have the computing tower.
Right.
But blockchain can actually be used to decentralize that.
Okay.
So you can create these platforms where anyone can contribute their data, their algorithms, their computing power.
Okay.
And then other people can access those resources through the blockchain.
Okay.
So it creates this kind of like shared economy for AI.
Gotcha.
And this has a lot of potential benefits because it can make AI more accessible to smaller companies, to researchers, to individuals.
Right.
It can also help to promote innovation because it allows people to collaborate and share ideas more easily.
Yeah.
And it can also help to address some of the ethical concerns around AI.
In what way?
Because by decentralizing AI,
you're reducing the power of any one entity to control it.
Right.
Right. So you're making it more democratic, more transparent, more accountable.
So those are like some really, really interesting ways. These two things can work together. So I know you've got a lot of examples too about how this is playing out, like in the real world.
Right. In different industries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So where do you want to start with that?
Well, I think healthcare is a really good one to start with.
Okay.
Because we already talked about the potential for blockchain to secure patient data.
Right.
Right. But when you add AI to the mix,
you
can do some really amazing things.
Like what?
So, for example, you can use AI to analyze that patient data.
Okay.
To identify patterns that might indicate early signs of disease.
Okay.
Right. So this could lead to earlier diagnosis, earlier treatment, and potentially better outcomes for patients.
Yeah, that makes sense. You can also use AI to develop personalized treatment plans.
Okay.
Right. So based on a patient's individual genetic makeup, their lifestyle, their medical history, the AI can recommend the best course of treatment.
Okay.
And then, of course, the blockchain is there to ensure that all of that data is secure and private.
Right.
Right. So it's a really powerful combination.
Yeah. And it's only as good as the data that's input into it.
Exactly.
Right. And so that's where I think, this idea of like using blockchain to secure that data is
absolutely
crucial.
Yeah, it creates that foundation of trust.
Right.
Right, that you need for the AI to work properly.
Okay, what other industries?
Another really interesting one is supply chain management.
Okay.
Right, so we talked about how blockchain can be used to track goods as they move through the supply chain.
Right.
But when you add AI, you can start to do things like optimize logistics.
Okay.
Right, so AI can analyze data about shipping routes, weather patterns, demand forecasts. And it can use that data to find the most efficient and cost-effective ways to move goods from point A to point B.